Let's start with the macro equilibrium. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Yield star, here's GDP star. And at this equilibrium, there is concern about inflation. What should we do? So this is going to be something, maybe the start of that long comprehensive problem is that you get some equilibrium, macro equilibrium, with some level of GDP and unemployment and some price level. And then you're given a little piece of information that helps guide you to what you might want to do. And you can stimulate, contract, or leave unchanged. So those are kind of your policy options, right? You see this information, you read it, you look at it, and you say, either I want to stimulate the economy, I want to contract the economy, or I want to leave the economy unchanged. And I should say that in the past I have done all three. So there's some where I want you to stimulate, some where I want you to contract, and some I want you to leave unchanged. And it's always disappointing to see people spend an entire 2 hours tracing out all the effects of macro policy when you can't do anything, right? If you're leaving it unchanged, no monetary policy, no fiscal policy, start your vacation, right? So make sure you know what you want to do in this case. So if we have this, suppose I want to use some policy. First I have to decide, is there anything I should do? Yeah?
No, what does that say? There is what about inflation?
There is concern about inflation.
We should contract.
Yes. We should contract the economy. So this is Paul Volcker, right? This is in the 80s when we had inflation rates where people were saying, oh, they're getting too high, they're pushing towards maybe hyperinflation, that's destabilizing for the economy, so we want to contract the economy. Great. I want you to use monetary policy. So I want you to go in and use monetary policy to contract the economy. So you're going to maybe outline the monetary policy tools, which are the discount rate, required reserve ratio, open market operations. So then I have to decide within those, what do these things mean? So I want the discount rate, which is the rate at which the Fed lends to member banks. I want that to be higher or lower?
Higher.
I want this to be higher. The required reserve ratio, which says how much the banks have to keep on reserve, higher. The open market operations, which has to do with the bond market, sell bonds, excellent. So that average that I posted doesn't really represent what's happening in the class, right? Because that was much quicker than my other class. Then in this, I might want to say, okay, if I know the required reserve ratio is increasing, I might want to trace out something like total deposit creation. So from chapter 13, we said, oh, if you change this thing, this changes the capacity of the bank to lend money, and that's captured by this, which is related to the money multiplier times excess reserves. So when they do this, this number changes, and this number changes, and this number going down. And you might want to show that in terms of there's money supply, and here is the money supply shrinking. And that's probably related to, all of this is related to, well, if I want to contract the economy, I want to shift the aggregate demand curve. So all of these policies, monetary and fiscal policy, are directed at shifting that aggregate demand curve either outward or inward. So if this is happening, money supply is shrinking, This means the loanable funds that are available for people to take out loans and buy stuff is getting smaller. If that's getting smaller, the aggregate demand curve should be shifting here. And that seems consistent. That's what you said, contract the economy. If the aggregate demand curve shifts in, I see a reduction in GDP, and it looks like maybe something with the price level. My favorite, though, is the bond market, right? So here's the price of bonds. Here's the demand for bonds. Here's the supply of bonds. Here's PV star. Here's QB star. You said open market operations itself. You might want to define open market operations as related to the FOMC, so the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the 7 Board of Governors and the 5 bank presidents. So something about the Fed structure, elected for 14 years, appointed for 14 years. If they sell bonds, this means more bonds are in the market. This means the price of bonds has decreased. And we said when the price of bonds decreases, the interest rate increases, and you know that because of this equation, right? The interest payment divided by the price you pay for the bond gives me my yield or my rate of return or my interest rate. So if the price of bonds goes up, the interest payment is constant, right? I'm getting like a $100 payment on a bond or a $50 payment on the bond. So if the price of the bond is going down, that means the yield or interest rate is going up. If that's happening, I'm interested in this. Here's the demand for loanable funds. And loanable funds are related to the interest rate. So you and I and businesses invest when the price of investment is cheaper. So we think the law of demand is in play. So as the interest rate goes down, the quantity demanded of loanable funds for you and I either to consume or for businesses to invest, I've been focusing on investment, that would increase. And if the interest rate increases, say from 6% to 8%, I should see this do this. And this I was looking at in terms of GDP and the price level. And I was looking at C plus I plus G plus NX. And we were looking at this one, right? But it could be both of these. So again, I expect AD double prime. Just call it AD prime in this case. A decrease in aggregate demand, consistent with contracting the economy, fantastic. You can also think about this in terms of the money supply, because this is actually, well, if they're selling bonds, they're giving you bonds, you're giving them money, so they're pulling money out of the economy, and then this stuff is also happening, so contraction of the money supply, same result, aggregate demand curve is shifting in, fantastic. The exchange market. Call it euros per dollar. No, don't call it that. Call it yen per dollar. The familiar one, right? Yen per dollar. So here's the demand. Here is the supply. So this is the US supplying dollars to the foreign exchange market. Here is Japan demanding US dollars. Here is the equilibrium exchange rate, call it 100. So this says 100 yen exchange for $1 US. Here's Q star. This is the quantity of dollars. So because the Fed has gone into the market in the US we're thinking about the interest rate across countries. And before they intervened in the US economy, we were maybe at an equilibrium where things were balanced and there was no reason for things to flow from country to country. But because our government changed this, there's now an imbalance between the two countries, right? We've raised our interest rate or our return compared to another country. So if you're thinking about putting your money into a bank account, it looks like the US bank accounts will be paying a higher rate of return, a higher interest payment than in Japan because we've changed our incentives. Because of that, I think something here might change. I think the supply of US dollars will increase. You're shaking your head. No disbelief? It's not true, right? Because the higher rate of return is in the US. So I actually probably want to bring funds to the US. So I think the supply of funds from the US perspective is actually going to be like this.
Yeah.
As prime. We want to keep more of our funds to get the higher rate of return in the US banks than before. The demand, Japan's probably saying, well, I can keep my money in the Bank of Japan, or I can convert it and bring it to the US and get the higher rate of return. So the demand for US currency? Increase. D prime. So I get something like this. 120 yen per dollar. So now I'm thinking about, okay, how does that affect net exports, which are exports minus imports. So the value of our currency has changed, so our government's taken an action to kind of do something with our economy, in this case contracted. That has an effect on the foreign exchange market. How does that affect exports and imports? And then how does that affect net exports, because that is part of aggregate demand. So let's see. US dollar has appreciated, the yen has depreciated, the US dollar is stronger, the yen is weaker. Decrease? Exports decrease, then I must know imports increase. So wait a minute, exports, for Japan to buy US stuff, it must be more expensive. That's true. They used to give up 100 yen to buy $1 worth of US stuff. Now they have to pay 120 yen, so everything's more expensive. They buy less of our stuff. For us, looking at buying Japanese products, now I can see, oh wait, I get 120 yen for each dollar. I actually have some extra yen to buy more stuff, so everything looks cheaper. We're going to import more. So this minus that means that this is net exports decreasing, so I get something like this. Here's my original aggregate demand, C plus I plus G plus NX. Here's my new one, 80 double prime, C plus I plus G plus NX, which decreased. So consistent with my policy, I want to contract the economy. I get a domestic kick, I get an international kick, both moving in the same direction. Just one last piece on the aggregate supply. I have my aggregate supply, which says, based on the cost of production, I'll either supply more or less. So if my cost of production is decreasing, I can supply more. The aggregate supply curve will shift this way. If my aggregate supply curve shifts this way, it means the cost of production is increased. Since it's a global economy, I'm using inputs from the US in terms of labor and other inputs in the production process, but I'm also buying inputs in the production process from other countries. And because of this, those things cost either more or less. If they cost more, shift like this. If they cost less, shift like this. Yes?
But we're not selling, only buying.
We're not selling, what do you mean?
Just like ours.
Cost of production, inputs I'm buying. Marcus?
I say that the cost of the supply would, you'd buy more because it costs less. The
So I
inputs are
supply
less,
more?
so it goes to the right.
Great. So the cost of production is cheaper. AS prime, therefore I can supply more, so if my wages were cheaper, I could supply more. If any of my inputs are cheaper, I can supply more at any given price. Fantastic, so the aggregate supply curve moves this way. I come back and say, okay, the first one is the domestic shock. From AD to AD prime. This was related to the investment component and maybe the consumption component, right? Keep it simple for just investment, but if you want to do both, that would be pushing the aggregate demand curve in. So I'd be moving from this original equilibrium to this one. So from A to B. Then I have the international component that shifts the aggregate demand curve again because the exchange rate went from 100 yen per dollar to 120 yen per dollar. The aggregate demand curve shifted in again. So here's my second thing. This is AD double prime. AD double prime is due to net exports decreasing. So this is net exports, this is investment or investment in consumption. This was the starting point. So I go from A to B to C. And then I get an aggregate supply curve shift from AS to AS prime. And I go from C to yes.
So B was from the exchange rate?
B to C
Or
was
just
from the exchange rate.
getting-
So this one was consumption and investment changing, this one was net exports changing, and this was due to the cost of production. So that would probably get you full credit for that. Tracing out all of this, and this was the most missed part in the homework assignments. People could nail the three policies, right, and usually the direction of the policies, but they didn't tell me anything about how these policies actually work, right? So here's chapter 13, the banking system. How does total deposit creation change based on the money multiplier, and the money multiplier is 1 over required reserve ratio. So that wasn't seen. Also, when we talked about buying and selling bonds, I rarely saw this, and I really like this because this is the spark for all of this stuff to happen. And then I think maybe one person in the class shifted the aggregate demand curve. That's the key. That's what all of this is about. So make sure you show me how this is affected and which component. Fiscal policy. There was one student who nailed both policies, but had them named incorrectly. Very painful to give 0 credit for. They knew everything, right? But they had just reversed the names. That's a horrible case. So if I'm thinking about fiscal policy, I also want to kind of outline what are my fiscal policy tools. Well, I could use government expenditure. And I can either increase or decrease this, right? It depends on what I'm going to try and do. And I can also use taxes. So I can increase or decrease taxes. If my goal is to get from here, there is concern about inflation. I want to contract the economy. This time I want to use fiscal policy. Government expenditure should decrease, and taxes should increase. So either do this, or a combination of both. These are going to shift the aggregate demand curve too, right? Because this is equal to C plus I plus G. Well, that's that. And C would probably be this, right? I give you money, you guys go and consume, so consumption would change. So I'm looking at these two components, and I know that there's my starting aggregate demand. Both of these will shift the aggregate demand curve, right? So both of these are going to shift the aggregate demand curve to AD prime. So reducing government expenditure reduces this. Increasing taxes means you have less money to spend, so that reduces this. So that also shifts this here. And when I'm thinking about what we did earlier in the semester, we looked at aggregate demand curve shifts, and we talked about, well, there's an increase in government expenditure, and then this was 80 related to a tax cut. So I think to get full credit, when you talk about fiscal policy and you talk about the effects of fiscal policy, you probably want to go back to, there were some equations, the change in government times the Keynesian multiplier is going to give me some increase in GDP. So this injection goes to the Keynesian multiplier, kicks me out some increase in GDP. I could also do the change in taxes. That's also going to go through the Keynesian multiplier, except the MPC, right? People don't spend everything out of that additional dollar. They spend a fraction of that. So depending on the MPC, I give you a tax cut, you spend a fraction of that. Then that goes through the Keynesian multiplier, and I get a change in GDP. And we decided if this were the same amount, so equal tax cut, equal government expenditure, you get a bigger shift from the government expenditure than the tax cut. So if I'm thinking about this, I might want to highlight government expenditure is more stimulative. So government expenditure is more stimulative than an equal amount tax cut going to consumers. And that put me in that dilemma. So in one of your quizzes, you had to say, okay, how much do I have to inject for this to give me the same the same impact? So how much more do I have to give in a tax cut to get this to shift here, because this is actually my target. And then we extended this to, that was kind of the simple model. Then we extended that and said, wait a minute, this equation has to be changed a bit. Change in G times the Keynesian multiplier equals the aggregate demand shortfall. So I did this in a diagram, but I didn't call it anything. I left that kind of for you guys to figure out through either reading or just kind of solving. But this one was different because this says we're not in that Keynesian range where prices don't matter, where prices aren't changing. We're in that intermediate range. So a stimulus on the economy pushes the economy forward. Part of that's going to be an increase in GDP, but part of that is going to be eroded by price inflation. And because of that, this number is going to be different than this one here, which is usually called the GDP gap. This one's the aggregate demand shortfall. So let me just write this. Change in taxes times the MPC times the Keynesian multiplier equals the aggregate demand shortfall. And remember, right now I'm talking about the one we did in the previous case, right? This is the one that we're doing for this problem here, which I'm not doing. I'm doing it in the previous case. So we said, okay, if I wanted to shift the aggregate demand curve out, I could pump in some money, I could give a tax cut, I could figure these out. If I know the MPC, I then know the Keynesian multiplier. The extension to this was this part. This was that last question on your Keynes NPC question. Here's AD. You had an equilibrium here at some level of GDP, and you wanted to get to here, which was full employment. So you were in a macro equilibrium that was below the full employment equilibrium, so you wanted to stimulate the economy, and you said, oh, well, this is easy, right? Because the difference between here and here is a GDP gap. Plug that in here. If I know the MPC, I know the Keynesian multiplier, I know how much government expenditure to pump in to get this to happen. So you said, oh, well, I just need to shift out the aggregate demand curve by the GDP gap, do that in all places so you get kind of a parallel shift here. This is 80 prime. If that happens, I'm going to be there, which I think I'm going to get to my full employment equilibrium, but I actually don't make it, right? This was because of the price inflation, right? So some of my power of my stimulus policy actually got eroded because prices went up, so I couldn't buy as much, so I have to shift it out further. That's this one. Aggregate demand shortfall. So it's a little different than the gap because I have to overshoot, kind of overshoot, because after correction, I want to get back to that point. So my aggregate demand curve, call it 80 double prime. I actually have to overshoot this. That distance there, aggregate demand shortfall. So that's the difference between the two. One, I kind of know the GDP gap and everything's kind of easy. I don't have to worry about price inflation. I can use the simple version. If prices are relevant, then I have to go to this one and look at aggregate demand shortfall. Same basic idea. But now I get to full employment after correcting for prices. I'm going to leave this one for you. But you definitely want to account for the divergent impact of government and taxes. They're different. So that would get you full credit for that. Yes.